Tommy the Blade O'Connor, Sarah Hayes, and Marcus Flynn thought they had survived Liverpool's darkest days. They were wrong. The man they once feared more than anyone, the Kingpin, has returned. Quiet, calculated, unstoppable, and now, every choice they make could mean survival or disappearance. Liverpool will never be the same. Liverpool had changed. The roar of the docks, the clatter of the trams, and the distant hum of nightclubs had not disappeared, but the pulse of the city's underworld had grown faint, almost imperceptible. Lime Street, once a labyrinth of whispered deals, neon lights, and shadowed corners where power was measured in fear, now seemed calmer. The bars still buzzed, the shops still opened, but the invisible hand that had ruled the city with an iron grip had been gone for years. For a decade, the people of Liverpool had been told that he was gone for good. His name had been spoken in hushed tones. The Kingpin. He had built an empire that spanned the city, controlling clubs, gambling dens, and the underground networks that thrived behind closed doors. He had been untouchable, a man whose reputation alone kept rivals at bay. When the law finally caught him, locking him away in a maximum security prison, it felt like a collective exhale for the city. Streets that had been tense with unseen threats now felt open. People went about their lives believing that the worst had passed. Then the news came, sudden and almost surreal. He was free. The announcement hit like a shock wave. The city collectively held its breath. Liverpool's media struggled to make sense of it. The court records were sparse. No one could say why he had been released, and that was precisely the point. The mystery made him even more dangerous. The Kingpin, a man who had once inspired terror in the hearts of seasoned criminals, had walked out of prison without a single sign of struggle, a calmness in his gait that spoke of control, patience, and calculation. Cameras outside the prison captured him stepping onto the street. He carried nothing but a worn leather briefcase. There was no entourage, no security detail, no fanfare, only the quiet certainty of a man who knew he still belonged in the shadows of the city he had once ruled. People recognized him immediately, though few dared approach. He was older, lines etched into his face, hair streaked with gray, but the aura of authority remained. Liverpool felt the tremor of his return almost immediately, even before he had made a single move. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said he had struck a secret deal with people in power, that influential figures had ensured his release for reasons no one could imagine. Others whispered of unfinished business, debts unpaid, promises left uncollected. There were those who believed his return meant the city would once again descend into chaos, while a few feared the calm was only temporary and that a storm of unseen violence was already gathering. Across Liverpool, old allies watched nervously from safe distances. Those who had once operated under his command, and even those who had profited in his absence, now wondered if their hard-won independence could survive. Some began quietly retracing old lines of communication. Others strengthened security in ways that had long been forgotten. Every phone call, every transaction, every small detail was measured and weighed, because even a single mistake could draw his attention. Yet in the public eye, there was no immediate confrontation. No shooting, no high-profile raid, no dramatic announcement. The Kingpin moved silently, deliberately. His return was not about immediate dominance. It was about presence, about reminding everyone that the hand that once ruled Liverpool's underworld had not weakened, that even after years in isolation, he could still bend the city to his will without firing a shot. Liverpool felt it in the air. The tension, the uncertainty, the sense that something long buried was stirring. And though no one knew the full scope of what he intended, one thing was certain: the streets of Lime Street and perhaps the entire city would never be the same again. The Kingpin was back, and with him came the unmistakable promise that old debts would be collected, old scores settled, and the ghost of his empire would return, haunting every corner of the city he had once ruled. The streets of Liverpool were never truly quiet, but the underworld had changed during the Kingpin's absence. 10 years of his absence had allowed former allies to carve out their own empires, each claiming pieces of territory he once ruled with an iron fist. The city's criminal landscape had grown fragmented. No single figure held absolute power, and those who had survived the old wars had learned to adapt, to negotiate, to avoid unnecessary conflict. The Kingpin had been gone, but his shadow lingered in stories, rumors, and the occasional whispered warning. Now, with his return, the delicate balance that had been built over a decade began to tremble. Former lieutenants, who had once obeyed without question, now faced impossible decisions. Some had moved on, trading crime for legitimate businesses, bars, restaurants, property investments, even offices in high-rise buildings. They had lives that depended on lawfulness, not fear. Others had assumed leadership of smaller gangs, consolidating their control over corners of the city. Each had their own power, their own reputation, but none had forgotten the man who had once been untouchable. Rumors of his release reached these old allies through encrypted messages, anonymous phone calls, and casual sightings. He had not made a public declaration, yet his presence was felt everywhere. Shipments went missing, bank accounts showed unusual activity, and nights that were once routine became tense. No one knew when or where he might appear, but everyone understood the meaning. He was back, and he was watching. The Kingpin did not announce his return with violence. Instead, he tested loyalty and gauged weakness. He moved quietly, like a predator circling his territory, observing the city's new rulers with patience. Surveillance cameras, once ignored, now became tools of caution for those who had once been fearless. Streets were patrolled with a new wariness. Contacts were rechecked. Business deals postponed. Liverpool's underworld had grown confident in his absence, and that confidence became a vulnerability he would exploit. Some former allies began to debate their options. Should they resist, risk confrontation, and attempt to maintain control over the territories they had fought so hard to claim? Or should they bend the knee, offer tribute, and accept the return of a king they had once served? Every choice carried risk. Resistance could mean violent retribution. Submission could mean humiliation, a loss of respect, and the slow erosion of their own power. The city had never been more tense, and the stakes were higher than ever. The Kingpin's approach was methodical. He did not attack openly, nor did he seek immediate domination. He allowed fear to spread subtly, in small, deliberate ways. A warehouse emptied overnight, a shipment redirected without explanation, an ally's reputation quietly undermined. These acts were not random. They were messages, reminders of what he had once controlled and what he could reclaim. Liverpool's criminal landscape was being rewritten without a single shot fired, and those who had once felt safe now realized how fragile their positions had become. Every old ally felt the pressure differently. Some froze, paralyzed by fear and indecision. Others moved cautiously, trying to negotiate behind closed doors, reaching out to people they had once betrayed or ignored. Still, a few plotted quietly, hoping they could exploit weaknesses in his strategy. Each day brought a new test, a new calculation. The Kingpin had returned not just as a man but as a force, invisible yet omnipresent, reminding the city that the balance of power could shift in an instant. Liverpool itself felt the change. Streets that had seemed ordinary carried tension. Nightclubs and betting shops became more cautious, wary of inspection or interference. People whispered in bars, glanced over shoulders, and wondered who would be the next target. The city's underworld was alive with speculation, but no one could predict the Kingpin's next move. One thing was certain. His return was more than personal ambition. It was a reclamation of a kingdom that had grown restless in his absence. A slow, deliberate siege on the very soul of Liverpool's criminal life. The first act of the Kingpin's return was subtle, yet it sent shockwaves through Liverpool's criminal world. A rival crew, emboldened by his absence and eager to expand into the heart of Lime Street, had begun asserting control. They moved confidently, unaware that the city's former ruler had already returned. Their arrogance was their mistake. By morning, their offices were ransacked. security cameras mysteriously disabled, and shipments vanished without a trace. Scrawled across the side of a building was a single chilling word: remember. It was a warning, but it was also a demonstration. The Kingpin was not making idle threats. He was showing the underworld that he still held power, and that he could strike with precision. The raid was carefully planned, leaving no fingerprints, no witnesses who could speak freely. The rivals realized too late that resistance came with consequences. Fear spread quickly, and the city's gangs began to reevaluate their positions, questioning the safety of every deal, every alliance, every corner they thought they had claimed. The Kingpin did not need to confront them directly. Violence, when visible, attracts law enforcement, media attention, and unnecessary complications. Instead, he used silence, uncertainty, and the psychological weight of his reputation. The mere idea of his presence was enough to disrupt operations, to make rivals hesitate, to force former allies to reconsider loyalties. Liverpool's underworld, once confident and bold, now operated with caution. Every transaction was scrutinized, every meeting was questioned. Trust had become a scarce commodity. Among the affected crews, whispers spread like wildfire. Some began to speculate about how he had returned, imagining secret deals, corrupt contacts, and untouchable influence. Others feared that no one was safe. A shipment lost here, a vanished car there, a missing employee somewhere else. It all pointed to a man who was patient, calculating, and willing to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Liverpool's criminal networks felt the invisible grip tighten, and no one could say where it would lead next. Law enforcement, meanwhile, was baffled. There were reports of missing shipments and vandalized property, and no one could say where it would lead next. Law enforcement, meanwhile, was baffled. There were reports of missing shipments and vandalized properties, but no arrests, no suspects. The crimes were deliberate, but left no traceable evidence. It was as if the Kingpin was orchestrating a campaign of fear rather than chaos, reminding the city that his return was more than a headline. It was a slow, strategic reclaiming of control. Police patrols increased, but their presence had little effect. The Kingpin was careful, always one step ahead, using knowledge of the city and its people to move unseen. Old allies watched with a mixture of awe and terror. Those who had hoped he would remain a memory realized that the past could not be contained. Some quietly attempted to realign their alliances, negotiating with rivals in hushed meetings and secret calls. Others took defensive measures, bolstering security and hiding assets, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. The atmosphere was tense. Liverpool had not seen anything like this in years. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. As the days passed, the Kingpin's method became clearer. He was not in a hurry. His goal was not immediate domination, but the gradual erosion of confidence. He exploited weaknesses, observed behaviors, and tested loyalty without exposing himself unnecessarily. One crew underestimated him and suffered losses that could never be replaced. Another chose to bend, sacrificing pride to survive, and through it all the Kingpin remained invisible, a force of nature whose presence was felt in every corner of Lime Street and beyond. Liverpool's underworld had learned a terrifying lesson. Defiance came with risk, but submission could also carry unseen consequences. The Kingpin had returned not only to reclaim territory, but to remind everyone that in his city, fear was currency, and patience was a weapon. By the end of that first week, the message was clear: no one was untouchable, and no empire built in his absence would remain unchallenged. Weeks passed, and Liverpool's underworld felt like a city holding its breath. The Kingpin did not need grand displays of violence to assert dominance. His strategy was subtler, more terrifying. He moved like a shadow through the city, striking precisely where it would hurt most, dismantling the foundations of his former allies' power, without ever revealing himself fully. The city watched as territories that had seemed stable for years began to shift, and those who had once felt secure realized that their positions were fragile. The Kingpin targeted key assets first. Nightclubs where deals were made vanished from their usual routines. Warehouses storing contraband appeared emptied without warning. Influential figures, those who had risen in his absence, suddenly found themselves isolated, their allies hesitant to support them for fear of attracting attention. Each act was calculated, designed to destabilize, intimidate, and remind the city that he was not just back. He was reclaiming his kingdom piece by piece. Former allies were forced to make impossible choices. Some tried to resist, believing they could outsmart him or rally support from others who had once served under the Kingpin. But resistance came at a heavy cost. One particularly daring attempt to seize back control ended in the mysterious disappearance of 3 prominent figures, their fates unknown, their absences serving as a grim warning to anyone considering defiance. Fear spread faster than the Kingpin's direct actions. Paranoia crept into every meeting, every handshake, every transaction. Others chose submission, bending to his will in small, careful steps. They paid tribute, handed over information, and acquiesced to minor demands, hoping to avoid personal catastrophe. Yet even this approach carried its own dangers. Loyalty was no guarantee of safety. The Kingpin tested every pledge, probing for weaknesses, planting seeds of distrust, and manipulating alliances so that friends could become enemies overnight. Liverpool's criminal networks found themselves in a game they could not fully see, playing by rules dictated by a man who had once ruled them all. As weeks turned into months, his influence spread beyond the underworld. Ordinary citizens noticed the subtle shifts. Certain shops suddenly closed, deliveries failed, and street rumors hinted at a man who had returned to claim what was his. Police investigations struggled to keep up. The Kingpin left no evidence behind, no fingerprints, no witnesses willing to speak. Only a trail of uncertainty that disrupted both legal and illegal operations alike. Liverpool became a city of whispered fear, of cautious glances over shoulders, of alliances held together by nothing more than fragile hope. Even former allies, who had survived the old wars, felt the pressure. Meetings in safe houses became tense exercises in calculation. No conversation was without suspicion. Communications were encrypted, schedules constantly shifted, and loyalty was tested at every turn. The Kingpin's return had not only destabilized territories, but had forced everyone to reassess their sense of security. Those who had once been bold, aggressive, or reckless now acted with care, knowing that a single misstep could have devastating consequences. By the end of the year, the Kingpin had achieved something remarkable. He had reclaimed influence without ever needing to dominate openly, without the chaos of open warfare. The city's criminal hierarchy had been rewritten quietly, subtly, but irrevocably. Former allies either bent to his will, disappeared from the streets, or struggled in an increasingly hostile environment. Liverpool itself seemed to respond to his presence. The air felt heavier, the nights longer, and even the public streets carried a tension that was almost tangible. The Kingpin had proven that true power was not about brute force. It was about patience, precision, and the ability to manipulate fear. His methods were surgical, his strategy long-term, and his reach absolute. By the time anyone realized the full extent of his return, it was too late. Liverpool's underworld had changed, and every player in it knew one undeniable truth: in the game of power, the Kingpin had already won. By the end of the year, it was clear that Liverpool had changed forever. The Kingpin had returned not as a man desperate to reclaim lost ground, but as a calculated force, deliberate and patient. The city's underworld, once fractured and complacent, now existed under his quiet, omnipresent influence. Those who had resisted had vanished or been broken. Those who submitted did so with a mixture of fear and resignation. Every street corner, every nightclub, every hidden alley that had once belonged to someone else now carried a shadow of his control. Despite his absence from public view, his presence was unmistakable. People saw the subtle signs, the sudden closures of certain establishments, the mysterious disappearance of key figures, and shipments rerouted with uncanny precision. Business leaders, gang members, and even casual observers began to realize that no corner of the city was untouched. Liverpool had become a chessboard, and the Kingpin was the master player, moving pieces invisibly, ensuring that every action reinforced his authority. Law enforcement was left bewildered. Investigations into disappearances and missing shipments yielded nothing. There were no witnesses willing to speak, no tangible evidence to follow, and no patterns that could be exploited. The Kingpin had perfected the art of control without exposure. He was untouchable, not because of brute force, but because he had learned to manipulate fear, silence, and uncertainty. His return had rewritten the rules of power. Dominance was not proven by chaos, but by the quiet, constant pressure that left everyone else unsure of their next move. Former allies, who had once sought independence, now had to navigate a world where loyalty was the only currency that mattered. Some had adapted, carefully negotiating their survival by appeasing him with information, money, or minor favors. Others tried to flee, abandoning territories or leaving the city entirely, hoping that distance could shield them from his reach. Few succeeded. The Kingpin had built a network that extended beyond the visible, an invisible web that ensured he remained aware of every decision made in his former empire. Liverpool itself felt the transformation. Streets that had seemed ordinary now carried an undercurrent of tension. Business owners locked doors earlier, employees whispered in corners, and rumors became as valuable as money. Even the nightlife, once vibrant and unrestrained, was subdued. People sensed the presence of a man who demanded respect, not through spectacle, but through the subtle, pervasive assertion of control. The city had learned, often painfully, that some legacies could not be erased, and some rulers could never truly be forgotten. And yet, the Kingpin's story was unfinished. No one could predict the next move. The city could guess, speculate, and fear, but the man himself remained invisible, a shadow in every alley, a ghost in every club, a whisper on every street. He had become both legend and menace, a reminder that power was not measured in guns or violence alone, but in strategy, patience, and the ability to reshape the world from behind the scenes. By the time Liverpool fully realized the scale of his return, the message had been made clear. This was his city once more. The Kingpin had returned, not for revenge alone, but to reclaim every piece of an empire he had once built. Those who had fled or resisted had paid the price, and those who had submitted had gained only a temporary reprieve. Fear had returned to Lime Street, subtle but pervasive, shaping decisions, alliances, and lives. As the city continued to hum with daily life, beneath it ran the current of control, the invisible hand of a man who refused to be forgotten. Liverpool had survived his absence, but now it existed under the weight of his return. The streets whispered his name in secret, the alleys waited for his next move, and the city learned the hardest truth of all. Some rulers never truly leave, and the Kingpin was no exception. Liverpool had become his kingdom again, and every shadow, every corner, every heartbeat of the city reminded its people that the Forgotten Kingpin had returned.